Hello, everybody, and on behalf of the Trust, Accountability and Inclusion Collaborative, we want to thank you again for agreeing on having this conversation on how funders can better support pro-democracy narratives around the world. This conversation is part of the 3D Dialogues, a space for learning and action for funders working to strengthening democratic and civic space around the world. And my name is Jerry Menendez, and I am the Communications Officer of the TAI Collaborative and one of the coordinators of the 3D Dialogues. Let's start with a quick round of introductions. Let's say our names, our affiliation, and one word to describe the democratic narratives landscape today. Ignacio, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Yeri. I'm Ignacio Saiz. I'm based in New York. I am an advisor to the Trust, Accountability and Inclusion Collaborative and co-moderator, along with Yeri, of the 3D Dialogues, the community of funders working on democratic and civic space. I would say from reading and looking at the work of all of you gathered in this space, I am inspired by the narrative work that is taking place in different contexts and regions. Pass it over to Janina.
I'm Janina Well. I'm political scientist from Latin America. I work at the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy in Geneva, in Switzerland. And the first sentence that comes to my mind to describe the narratives is dispute for the meaning, I would say. I think there is a clear dispute for the meaning of democracy and political participation. So I should nominate someone, Roberta.
Thank you, Janina. Hi, everyone. My name is Roberta Braga. I'm the founder and executive director of an organization called the Digital Democracy Institute of the Americas, DDIA for short, originally from Brazil, but based in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. I would say the narrative landscape is borderless, cyclical, and actually predictable. And that is both a good and a bad thing. We can talk more about that later. And I'll pass it over to Tessa.
My name is Tessa Dooms from South Africa. I'm the director of programs for a political think tank called the Rivonia Circle. We do work to encourage people's participation in politics and a reimagining of the democratic space from community level through the political space and around politics being more than just electoral politics, but also people's power. My one word or one phrase for expressing what I think is the nature of democratic narratives at the moment is frustrating. Des.
I kind of had a feeling that Tessa was going to nominate me. Yeah, my name is Deus Valentine Royemamu. I'm the founding director of the Center for Strategic Litigation based in Tanzania, which works to confront the authoritarian crisis in mostly Eastern and Southern Africa. The way I would describe the current landscape insofar as the narrative is concerned is it's a work in progress.
Hi, my name is Stefania Kapronsai, and I've been a human rights defender for 20 years in Hungary. And I co-led an organization called Hungarian Civil Liberties Union for 12 years. I'm a big believer in building resilient democracies through using more people power, not only on elections. And the word that I would use to describe the democracy narrative landscape in my country is desperate.
So together over the next hour, we're going to explore what narratives are currently shaping democratic participation in your context today, what kinds of narrative work have actually made a difference, and what could funders do differently to support strategic and impactful narrative change?
So for me, I think the big thing in South Africa when it comes to democratic narratives is it's laced with a lot of disillusionment from communities and from citizens and from voters that is being met with from activists and from people within politics, a kind of disdain for anyone who questions democracy or anyone who questions whether or not democracy as we have it right now is working. And so there's a growing sense, at least from the side of communities and voters and people who actually have progressive ideas in their minds about what needs to change, but are lured by retrogressive leadership or retrogressive ideas, because those are the only people willing to listen to them. But what you end up having is a sense that democracy has become overwhelmed by elite capture, and that democracy is an elite project for elites to benefit, and that anyone who's pro-democracy must be benefiting either themselves or elite forces. The outcomes of democratic participation don't make you feel freer, don't make you feel safer, don't make you feel like you have any autonomy over your life, and don't make you economically better off than your parents' generation were before you, who were in a blatantly undemocratic system. And so it feels like democracy is failing, and the people who claim to be the biggest champions of progressive ideas are, instead of listening to people, are actually shunning people, and they're doubling down on the status quo and protecting the status quo. But we've been distracted by the autocratic turn. And so instead of the conversation being about how do we get a better democracy through ideological debates, through shifts in the way we see the political economy, etc., we have now gone into just defend mode. And in the meantime, the autocrats and people with poor intentions, bad intentions, who don't have progressive ideas on their minds and don't care about people's power, are the ones that are forging ahead, because they are getting the space to reimagine the future that they want unabated.
At DDIA, we're working to build a healthier internet for Latinos and Latin Americans. And a part of that is bringing together experiences, narratives, trends in the US and Latin America and vice versa. So last year, we actually used public opinion research and narrative analysis to map out the narratives that were penetrating the most among voters, and to kind of look at who were the folks that were seeing and believing certain things and what might have been the drivers of engagement with those things. And so to Tessa's point, the narratives that penetrated the most were the ones that had to do with elites and institutions, and the dubious, perhaps, intentions that they have around manipulating society or keeping us down. For example, the two narratives that we tested that penetrated the most, that were more conspiratorial than false, were that corporations control politics and that individual voters have no say in the outcome. That was number one. And number two was that elites are conspiring with news and social media companies to keep the truth from us. So we actually did the work of mapping what we call meta-narratives that tend to be recycled across countries and across contexts and repeated over and over the years. And so that's what I meant when I said that things get, they become predictable. So the meta-narratives are, for example, around voting in elections, that elections are fraudulent and can't be trusted. That's the larger story. And under that, we see like 10 very common falsehoods: that dead people are voting, that foreigners are voting, that elections are rigged on the day of elections because of delays that are common, things like that. The second meta-narrative has to do with immigration. So the narrative being that immigrants are somehow ruining the fabric of our society. And here you can pick a country. In any country, you'll see this. And then under that, you see things like immigrants are criminals and gang members. Immigrants are the reason why our economies are failing. These are very, very common, and they only change in context. The third one, and there are many of these, but the third one I would say is this global control narrative. So the narrative that has to do with elites and institutions sort of conspiring to handle society in their own way to their own benefit. We've seen the rise of fringe narratives that have to do with this, that are now becoming more mainstream. and targeted at international institutions like the United Nations and the European Union and NATO, but also targeted at governments. And I think that's where we see huge problems. What we saw last year in our polling, and I'll leave it at this, is that uncertainty might actually be a better direction to focus our attention than belief. The majority of people that we polled were either rejecting or they were uncertain about the narratives and claims that we tested. 65% of 3,000 people that we polled. And so people are just either being very critical in what they see, if you want to be positive about it, or on the other side of it, very distrusting of absolutely everything they see online. And I think investing in understanding and listening to people is really important, as is investing in media, understanding information ecosystems and media ecosystems, because good narrative change work, I don't think, can be done without that element of it. So.
It's really extreme, it's really desperate, but I don't think it's only Hungary. It's in a way also Europe. And here I think I have to mention the war in Ukraine. And we in Europe, we were very privileged in the past 50 years that there rarely was a war in our region. But now that there is this war and there is this threat from Russia, and a lot of countries are kind of preparing to respond that, I think that also influences the narrative about democracy, what is possible, what we have to spend on. Do we have to spend on education or weapons? Do we have to, sacrifice some of our rights in order to protect our safety? But at the same time, just to give you, something hopeful, as you asked me for, with all this pressure on civil society, I think also kind of this narrative bubbled up, like, what is really civil society? What is it? What does it mean to be a citizen? In my experience in the 1990s and the early 2000s, that was not really a topic to discuss. But right now, because there are all these laws in Hungary that threaten independent media and independent civil society and threaten just people who don't agree, there is now this discussion about what does it mean to be a citizen, and I think that is something that is welcome.
Now, in Africa, I think the context, one has to appreciate the fact that state building was initially a post-colonial project. And I think one of the things that colonization of most parts of Africa led to was the destruction of indigenous institutions and the formation of the state upon an absent sort of political culture. So the Westminster or any other models that were introduced upon Africa did not take into account the lived realities of most of the colonial population. And we've continued to struggle with that to date, because even when the liberal democratic project was introduced, it was supplanted on a state that had very weak roots with, the traditional historical institutions of governance. And that made the whole democratic project very, very fragile. In the 90s, many of us in Africa embraced democratic reforms, not because it had a lot more to do with the transactional value of it, which was, you embrace these reforms and here comes the World Bank, the IMF, and they flood you with all the money you need to rescue your economies. It had a lot more to do with that than it had to do with the kind of pressure or popular struggle, as you saw in some exceptional cases like South Africa. Now, we then worked on 30 years of building a political elite that was on steroids provided by the IMF, the World Bank, and a whole host of donors, in the hope that maybe eventually they'll believe, in democratic norms and ideals, and that will become the order of the day, and the population will gain the necessary civic education to become effective actors in that equation. Now, what we're realizing now is that, of course, the political elite embraced these reforms because it was a necessary evil at that point in time.
Thank you, Ignacio, and thank you all of you for helping us shape the landscape. But now I want to invite you to give us hope and let us know with stories or concrete examples what type of democratic narrative work is working to empower democratic engagement.
There's actually a lot, I think, that does work. And sometimes when we think about solutions to things like online harms, like misinformation or extremism or hate, we think invest in X and not in Y, or this thing works, this thing doesn't work. Research shows that actually all of the interventions that we know well work. Things like debunking / fact-checking, pre-bunking inoculation, media literacy, explainers, information engagement, talking to people on and offline, coalition building at the grassroots level. And so for us, it's invest in all of those things and invest in understanding subgroups. For example, an intervention that works for a person that believes strongly in one of 15 narratives, false narratives, let's say, is going to be something like a fact check. But a person that believes in 14 of 15 false narratives, fact check would never work for that person, right? So they would need something like a depolarization intervention or community building on the ground, or to think through like what other contributing factors maybe took them down that path. And so I think for us, especially because we've done a lot of public opinion research, it's both, we know that it works to listen to people. It's not like a battle of narratives only. It's not this narrative wins out over this narrative. People are nuanced. And sometimes they recognize certain narratives are not okay, but because their life requires something else, or they have grievances, or they have hardships, they prioritize engaging with something else. In our context, for example, Latinos often said that they saw through some of the manipulation that Donald Trump was putting out there, but they needed a change to the economy. And they thought that he would be the change to the economy because the previous administration hadn't done enough for them to feel it. So I think for us, it's about that. It's like investing in uncertainty, which is something I mentioned earlier. So recognizing that the majority of people are not lost causes, that we are not dumb or gullible, that actually we are pretty critical, we are nuanced. And if we can just kind of understand how subgroups of people are engaging with information and how they're prioritizing what they're engaging with, who they trust, who they don't trust, why, all of that, then we can, I think, have a broader impact on the narrative change piece, because the narratives are not going to be one narrative for an entire demographic group, for example. It will require us kind of thinking through how we listen and engage on the level of where people are, not on the level of where we think or assume they are.
Yeah, just a quick comment, because this was in my mind from the beginning, and listening to Roberta, and I reinforced this idea of the dominant narratives are negative mainly, but beyond the negative, extreme. Yeah, it's important to reveal on what is possible, what we can really do, what, the micro level, in place of these big narratives like we are going to the fascist times, going back to the fascist times, or democracies are dying, or everything is super big. And also sometimes the narratives on the defense of democracy also are offering things that anyone thinking twice can feel that it's just impossible. So if you do build on what is really feasible, it's much easier, step by step, building, legitimizing. So this is my reflection on what was.
I'm really glad that Yanina went before me, because I want to respond using that as a starting point. Where the narrative conversation is right now is it's focused on trying to rebut the loud noises coming from big men. And what it does is it centers all of that. It centers the voices of those very people who we don't want to win this narrative battle. And so what has worked in our context, the work we've done with Rivonia Circle, is number one, focusing on what people actually need and want, which is their daily lives to change, and building narratives around that being the political struggle. The political struggle is not about who ascends to the highest office. It's about who changes the most local of circumstances. And unfortunately, what has happened in this kind of authoritarian turn is that you've had people ascending to the highest office by talking about and in the voice of people's concerns in local communities in ways that have been distorting it. And if you listen to them, it makes no sense that Donald Trump speaks as if he was at some point a working class man. But he doesn't have to even make that assertion. All he does is what good autocrats do. They just rehearse what they hear from the most vulnerable people, and those people feel heard in the mouth of that autocrat. And so our job is not to respond to big men. Our job is to listen to people, ordinary people in communities, and respond to their needs as practically as possible. We've done work in a program we call the Democracy Builder, and gone to about 100 communities that are rural, that are peri-urban, that are marginalized. Many of the people we engaged with, young people. And we found that two things worked really well in terms of shifting people's perception about democracy, governance, and politics. The first was the idea that democracy could be changed and altered and upgraded. So we used the phrase, South Africa's due for an upgrade, or democracy's due for an upgrade. And that really resonated with people, because they'd been sold the idea that democracy and institutions over the last 50 years are just set in stone. They're now, you either love them or you hate them, and that they can't be changed. And when we introduce the idea of what I call democratic innovation, people really actually get reinvested quite quickly. But what we also do is we reinforce the feminist narrative that the political is personal, by saying that the politics of the day that matters is the politics of what happens in your community, what changes your life, and how do you start using not only institutional power, but people's power to do that. And we do that by building agency through community projects. And we have watched people go from completely disengaged to incredibly engaged in their own work, in their own struggle, and in this idea that they can build the democracy that they want on their own terms by centering their own issues. And one of the things we don't credit the radical right wing or autocrats with is that they have, in many instances, painted very clear pictures of what the future could look like. I mean, most of it is lies and disingenuous, but they're painting pictures of the future. Sometimes what we're doing as progressives is painting pictures of the past. We're 30 years into our democratic project, and a lot of progressives in civil society had given over their power to the political elite, had given over so much of the decision-making and the governance of the country to the political elite, and said that our role as civil society is accountability. And so we only resist we hold accountable, but somebody else makes the decisions. That democracy is about giving away your power, not taking it. And I think that we have to start giving ordinary people in their communities the sense again that they can govern themselves and that they can hold in their hands the institutions of governance for themselves. We've heard a lot of young people, and I'll end with this anecdote. When we do our democracy builder exercise around South Africa 2.0, we ask people to imagine a different kind of democratic future when it comes to a particular issue. And we asked a group of young people in KwaZulu-Natal what they would change, and they chose local government, and they really pondered on it for about a half an hour. And they said the thing that they would change is they would scrap local government altogether, and they would make sure that national budgets are put in the hands of communities directly on a case-by-case basis, where the community has an active project where they are going to do the work of government.
I will give 3 very quick examples. One is about how we shouldn't replicate the narrative or engage in the narrative of the big man, as Tessa was saying. Civil society in Hungary is under attack since 2014, and we managed to measure, to conduct surveys about trust in civil society in 2019, 2021, and 2023. And actually what we have found is that trust in civil society is slightly increasing. And despite all the narratives about being traitors, serving foreign interests, using foreign funds to go against the nation, and so on, actually, the majority of Hungarians believe that it is the role of civil society to voice their opinion and highlight, amplify opinions of the public about political issues, not partisan issues, but political advocacy. So it's not only charity, what they expect from civil society. The second example is we have, interestingly, a very similar example in Hungary to, again, what Tessa was saying, that after 2018, we started to open regional hubs across the country and started to, instead of, like saying to local communities, this is the issue, what we are working on as a human rights organization, this is what we can help you with, but listen much more to what are the needs of people. And work together with small groups of activists, communities, in what they want to push forward. And actually look at ourselves more as like, okay, we have this knowledge and expertise of advocacy. How can we be useful? And we found that that increased trust in our work and increased hope and democratic resilience so much in these communities, because it was about what they see as a problem and not something from the outside coming, telling them. And then lastly, since 2015, we have a very strong hate campaign, like series of hate campaigns in Hungary, and it also targets LGBT people. But the approval rating for same-sex marriage since 2015 went up by 15%. And I think it's about the narrative of what we are using when campaigning against these laws. And it's not, engaging with the lies, the misinformation and the disinformation, but more like showing how LGBT people are just the same as you are. And in one campaign related to a referendum, in our campaign, we showcased fathers, coaches, teachers, work colleagues, talk about how they think that their LGBT student, child, or co-worker is a wonderful human being and needs support and just equal right.
We're going to ask you, please, to say in 1 minute one thing that you would like to see funders doing more of or doing better with regard to support for narrative change efforts, and one thing that you would like to see funders doing less of. Roberta, let me start with you.
Thank you, Ignacio. So one thing I would love to see funders invest in more is studying and building infrastructure for information ecosystems. Not so much content to counter content, but really understanding our spaces. For example, we do monitoring of over 2,000 public WhatsApp groups. We found really interesting things there. It's a world not a lot of people can see. So I think that there's a lot more opportunity for us to understand how communities are engaging inside information ecosystems and how those ecosystems contribute to the propagation of narratives that might be harmful, but also to what extent are people actually seeing and engaging with those? Because I actually genuinely believe, and the research shows that the majority of people are not believing the most extreme authoritarian narratives, even though social media might lead us to perceive that they are. So I think information ecosystems and invest in reducing perception gaps. And then one thing I would love to see less of is I think there's a tendency with technological development being what it is to shift and be very reactive to the moment. I know right now, for example, there's a huge focus on working with creators and working with AI. I think it's important for us to keep in mind that like we can't shift all investment toward the like shiny new thing of the moment and away from the things that we've been putting money into that are more foundational for a while. I think it's about incorporating thinking around, for example, new AI challenges, but not necessarily creating programming from scratch just to like all put the eggs into that basket. So I think it's thinking through how do you keep sustaining foundational work while thinking about the new elements of technology and information ecosystems that might contribute to that foundation.
I hope that people who are funding pro-democracy work invest a lot more in community-based engagement and a lot more in creating space for movement building at community levels, and that there's also an investment in innovation in those spaces as opposed to a need for cookie cutter models. Where's your curriculum? We just don't, that's not where we are right now. And if we want to build a different kind of future, we're going to need to think about this in a lot more innovative and entrepreneurial ways, rather than in ways that are very corporatized, cookie cutter type models. What I'd like less of is fear around politics and availing of political conversations within progressive circles particularly. The threats that we are facing are overtly going for political power. And autocrats don't care about anything except power. So if you want to actually build a democratic future that counteracts autocrats, you also have to be willing to invest in people taking power. And so this idea that you can counteract autocrats without having conversations about who should replace them and what should replace them is actually silly. What has hindered a lot of our work is the idea that we cannot take political sides in one of the most deeply politically charged moments in history, in recent history, at least. We have to become braver about investing in the political future of our countries and our continents and our regions, and not see that as a separate fight to building more democratic societies. And that's not to say that electoral power is all there is, but it's not something that we can afford to shy away from anymore and investing into.
I think there are global trends, maybe regional trends, but the solutions and the campaigns have to be very localized and very targeted, even much more targeted than national level. So I think trusting grantees with this, that they know how to talk to that certain community, that certain locality is key, and don't expect that big national or big regional or global campaigns will work locally. And I would emphasize as well that civil society, as in its current form that it keeps away from politics and political advocacy, it's not going to bring a solution to democratic decline. So in a sense, supporting Tessa's point, we have to understand Very's power in this new era and not shy away from using that power, because autocrats believe in that and thrive on that.
Yeah, my recommendation is based on the fact that democracy is local. And with saying that, I think I want to point out two things. One is to avoid generalizing and universalizing realities that may not necessarily be universal. And I think it's important that donors learn to appreciate those local contexts, because many a times programs are built and designed around global assumptions that don't really apply in some contexts, including some of the issues that Tessa has raised. I think two, what the donors really need to do is to invest in their listening infrastructure. It's very common for a lot of folks in the grant-making space. I could be a culprit myself, having worked in those spaces in my previous life, to not build a culture and the infrastructure for listening. So the idea is that somebody sends a proposal, and I picked up some tool vocabulary from the last conference I attended, and I think I understand exactly what they're trying to do, and I fully know and understand the context. Often we are invited to donor-sponsored conferences to listen. So we go there. Sometimes we are allowed the opportunity to teach or share what we know, but in most cases we are brought together with so-called experts from global universities to tell us all these theories about the work that we work and live in. And I think that needs to be flipped in a way. I would love to start going to conferences organized by us as partners or grantees, where we are the ones who are telling the donors what the reality is, and they sit and listen for a few days. I think that would really help to shift the manner of the partnership between those who have the resources on one hand and those of us looking for those resources.
I will build on what was said, because I really agree with all the comments by Tessa, Deus, and Stefania. So I do agree on the goal of building community and targeted solutions that Stefania, I think, and Deus said democracy works at the local level, but at the same time, and I think it's a complement, it's important to build networks regionally and globally. This is very important to empower these communities, and it's complementary to, I think, to this idea of targeted solutions at the local level. And then I fully agree with what Tessa said, but about electoral politics, I really agree with you, Tessa. But at the same time, I think that maybe for the donors, this is a bit challenging. We do need to intervene in electoral politics, but how? This is a challenge which probably we can keep discussing that in the future.
I think that where we are right now is a world that is in desperate need of change, right? And there are various, it expresses itself in different ways, in different contexts. But the response that is needed right now is the courage to change. And right now we are stuck in comfortable models, normative models. We don't want, things to change too much, because that would disturb the apple cart. But progressive politics and what has brought us through different eras of real change, you don't get real reforms without a viable threat of revolution. And we need to build people's power. So there's always a viable threat of revolution, but not revolution that is chaotic and will cost people their lives. Revolution that is generative of new futures, of new ideas, of new leaders. And if we don't do that intentionally, we will have the kinds of revolutions that will take people's lives. And so the courage to embrace change, I think, is one of the things that I hope for.